So good morning again, and we are going to continue our strategy for storms, flooding, and sea level defense. Our speakers that are on approach are from the Netherlands, and we begin with Jeroen Arts, Director, Department of Water and Climate Risk, VU University of Amsterdam, and he's going to talk about lessons from Shanghai and the Netherlands as far as resilience strategies. Dr. Arts is a nationally recognized resiliency expert. He's advised countries around the world, including New York. He's been in the United States extensively. He's been around the world. He's the author of some books that are very hard for me to follow, but I do get the pictures. So I appreciate that. And Jeroen, thank you very much I know it's a little later for you, and thank you very much for participating, and welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Stas, for giving me the floor, and good morning, everybody in the US. First question, do you see my screen, Stas?
Yes, we do.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so let me start my presentation. It's about two coastal cities, Shanghai in China and Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And both cities are essentially global economic hubs, so to say. They have both very large ports, which handle quite a lot of goods and services around the world. And both of these cities are confronted with two major projections, two major challenges in the future. The first one we have talked about quite a lot already is sea level rise. So in both cities, we expect approximately 3 feet of sea level rise in 2100. But there's another challenge, and this is socioeconomic trends. And we expect, because of the global increase in population, that also the economy will grow around the globe. And this will mean that these coastal cities with these large ports will have to increase their area in order to handle all these goods and services needed for the growing population around the world. And we see that, for example, in this graph, this recent study, that, for example, in China, port cities in general, they expect to increase their area with 180 to 280%. And in the USA, this is between 100 and up to 300% even, depending on the scenario that you look at. And if you want to increase your area of your coastal city, you have to invest, right? And I expect the investment in all global ports around up to $800 million US dollars. And because we are facing climate change, 6% of these costs are needed for climate change adaptation. So essentially, investment in infrastructure, which is the main theme of today. Well, looking at Shanghai, a very big city, very low lying, only approximately 9 feet above mean sea level. And Shanghai is already facing quite a lot of flooding, not only from surges from the sea, from typhoons, but also from local precipitation, like in Houston, we have seen a few years ago. And what we did for Shanghai, the city asked us to come up with resilience strategies. We first did a risk assessment where we classified, similar to the first street maps, the flooding situation now in the current climate, but also in the future. And you see from these maps that the inundations, the flood inundation potential will increase in the future, both to more rainfall, but also more flooding from the sea. And if you combine certain information, or the flooding information, with the exposed assets, you can say something about, let's say, the losses, the potential losses. And what we see is that the flood losses will increase so much that under, let's say, the high-end sea level rise scenario, we see that up to 10% of the GDP of the whole of Shanghai can be prone to losses. So that's quite a lot of potential of losses. So hence, there's also quite a lot of things at stake. So what is then the strategy? Well, the first strategy is to look at, let's say, the smaller things that you can protect, like critical buildings, critical infrastructure with these kind of flood walls, for example, or also look at spatial planning in the city and, for example, elevate entrances of subways. The second one is a larger investment in seawalls like this one around the city of Shanghai, which protects the city against storm surges. Similarly to what is being discussed in the Galveston area with the Ike Dike. And Shanghai has a history also in doing so, in building flood protection. And you see this here in this river flood wall. They have built some a wall in 1960s, upgraded the wall in 1970, and then upgraded it again in 1990. So you see a history of adapting actually to nature. But more is to come. And what they also have proposed is to look at a nature-based solution in front actually of the seawall to see if they, let's say, additional wetlands may reduce the force of the waves on this seawall. And is this, let's say, some kind of futuristic idea? Well, like here in New York, for example, there were also some guys who thought like, well, maybe we can create wetlands near the Battery Park. But not really. If you look in Hong Kong, for example, they indeed have developed nature-based solutions in front of skyscrapers. So it is possible. Does it make sense economically? Yes. Mary already talked about benefit-cost ratios, and we see a similar pattern here in Shanghai. If you look at the different possibilities from flood walls to wetlands, all have a positive benefit-cost ratio. That means that for every dollar that you invest in protection of a city, you get a high return of your dollar. So it makes sense. Then another thing is that you cannot protect everything. If you put a surge barrier over here, then it means that this port area is also not accessible anymore, which is not good for the port. So in Shanghai, they have decided to actually bring the port outward of the city. So they have built a bridge, a 22-mile long bridge, to a new artificial island that they have created here. And this island is elevated up to 20 feet above sea level, so it is protected also against future sea level rise. And they have built a huge container terminal on top of this artificial island. So this island is actually then of this port area is actually prepared for the future. So is this new? Well, if you look at our own country, it's not new. This old church, this 1,000-year-old church, has been built already on a man-made elevated hill. So we already knew about that in the future. People have adapted throughout the centuries against, let's say, the forces of nature. And also in the city of Rotterdam is also a port city. We have done the same. So first we looked at, let's say, protection type of measures, like this big surge barrier. And I've put a picture of the Eiffel Tower next to it. So these gates are as big as the Eiffel Tower, and they are needed to protect the city against high surges. And these gates are open to give access to the port under normal conditions. But also, like in Shanghai, the Netherlands has decided to bring the port outwards towards the sea, actually. And you see here the Maasvlakte port, which is reclaimed land from the sea. And what happens then to the old port terminals inside of the city, so to say, inland? Well, this is a picture of the port of Rotterdam in the 1940s. So that means in the Second World War. And they have reconverted these old port areas into residential areas, adding value to the old city center. Altogether, what we here see is actually a sort of development of a multi-layer safety system, where you look at different layers of safety to protect cities, going from, let's say, layer 4 and 3, emergency response and recovery type of layers, like insurance that you also have in the US, to spatial planning type of measures, building codes, elevating buildings, to, let's say, layer 1, which is protecting a large part of the city with flood walls, etc. I hope you like my presentation. I'm open also for questions. Thank you.
Jeroen, excellent. You covered a huge amount of ground, and it's very interesting to see the strategies in Shanghai and in Rotterdam. Excuse me. Our next speaker is Dirk Jan Valstra, who is with Deltares, and Mr. Valstra is director of the hydraulic engineering department and excuse me, advanced flood protection research and design is his topic. Dirk-Jan, thank you for being here, and you have the floor.
Thanks, Tas, and thanks for having me. I hope you can see my screen now.
We can. Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit. Well, it's a nice follow-up on Jeroen's talk. We actually didn't tune it into each other, but I think it follows nicely. So I'm going to talk a bit more on detail. So I'm talking about experimental facilities that we have here. You see a picture of me here without my Corona beard. It's our largest facility there. To give you an idea, the width of this facility here, you can see my mouse, I think, is about 15 feet wide, and it's about 900 feet long. And I've got some cool pictures showing that later. But I'm putting it into the context of the advanced flood research and design that we're doing at Deltares as well. So Deltares, Catherine already mentioned it a little bit. Deltares is a knowledge, we call a knowledge institute. So it's not a research institute. It does research, but also does a lot of applied research and a lot of advice. So it is in that sense a mix between, let's say engineering consultants and the university. So we're a bit in between. And a lot of the tools that we develop and the software that we develop, we provide for free. So let me jump into some nice pictures. Well, here in the middle, Jeroen did a good job. He showed the real thing. Here is a model that we made for it, well, about 30 years ago or so, where we tested that new design in a small scale model. So in reality, this is about the length of the Eiffel Tower. And in the model, it was about, I think, about 3 meters, so about 10 feet or so. Here to give you an idea of our biggest facility, the Delta Flume, it's about 300 meters wide. You see in this picture, you looked sort of towards the model hall. That's where the models are usually being built. This big blue wall here is the wave pedal that's actually moving up and down about 15 feet backwards and forward to generate waves. It's, as I said, 900 feet long, about 30 feet deep. And we can make about 15 feet high waves in this facility. And we have that for a reason. The reason why we have such a large scale facility is because if you want to test, for example, the strength of a breakwater or a dune or tubes or geocontainers, you need to do that preferably on a 1-to-1 scale. That's not always possible, but by having a big facility, you get close to that real live prototype scale, as we call it, as possible. And that's what we use it for. Another very nice example here is this wave slamming that we do against, for example, a quay wall or for example a monopile structure in offshore wind or offshore oil, and that we do that outside the model hall. You can see the model hall here in the back, because otherwise we blow off the roof. So we've well, in the past we've learned that the hard way. Let's put it that way. So we do it outside, just in front of the model hall, and you can see, it's more or less it's not on a 1-to-1 scale, but it gives you a good idea of the strength of these waves. Here, we actually test traditional dikes. Well, we've been building these dikes for hundreds of years. So you think, why would you still need to test them? Well, they have to be tested against the new conditions that are coming because of climate change. So we want to test to make sure that these traditional old dikes are still, safe enough for these new conditions. In that sense, I mean, it's expensive research and testing, but at the same time, you can save a lot of money. So the Flume has been with us for about 5 years now or so, and in the first experiment alone, the first test alone, we saved the Dutch government about $40 million in cost. So in that sense, it's always a nice example that, let's say, testing and researching pays off. Nature-based solutions, we're also looking into that. So here you see a couple of plots where we're sort of putting in willow trees, and we're testing them to sort of for wave attenuation and sort of figuring out what level of wave dampening do you get with this kind of willows. And we even tested them with leaves and without leaves. So in the weekend, a couple of colleagues came around and handpicked, took all the leaves off the trees to make sure to test it in, let's say, winter conditions. Another recent example is a glass wall to test that for strength. You see it here. It's not so clear maybe, but here you see a glass wall. This is about 1 meter high. That is another, more sort of visually attractive way of coastal protection, especially in urbanized areas, that can really help in convincing people that this has to be done. And even there, we tested it with this is a trunk of a birch tree that was sort of slammed against the wall to test it for strength in that sense as well, because sometimes these trees float in the river and hit against the structure. It's not your typical glass. Here you see the thickness of the glass. It's multiple layers with some plastics in between. Anyway, the test went totally fine. It's actually being implemented now. So a wide range of experiments. And yeah, why I'm sort of going to the next part of my presentation. And yeah, why do we need this testing? Well, I think, as Jeroen also said, and the plot here is a different way of showing the similar thing. Every coastal defense structure is going to be impacted by sea level rise during its lifetime. So it's something we need to deal with. We don't know how high it's going to be. We don't know how fast it's going to rise, but what we do know that it's going to happen. But it's highly uncertain. And especially for these coastal protection, I don't have to tell everybody that this is a very costly business. So doing it in an efficient way and is an economical way is of course an important thing. So just assuming the worst case scenario is obviously not the way to go for it. So really thinking about making adaptive coastal protection measures, designing them can really help. So postponing your investments, but planning for future adaptations is sort of key in dealing with sea level rise. So I've taken a simple example from a colleague, Marcel van Gent, who did this research, and I've taken his results. So let's assume you have a dike, a simple dike, and you want to protect it for flooding, and assume that you cannot increase the dike because there's too much buildings around, it would take too much space. So which kind of adaptation measures do you have? You could, for example, make an offshore breakwater, increase the foreshore to do the wave damping. You could increase the roughness of your dike. You could make the crest wall and make a glass wall, as I just said. But what you could also do is strengthen the inner slope for wave overtopping and make it more make it stronger there. So you've got all these options, and yeah, you don't have to do them all at the same time. You can put them in sequence and combine them. And that's the step 2 in what I'm presenting here. So it's working out these options, these adaptive pathways. So the first thing that you do is you select or you come up with these feasible solutions. You quantify how much sea level rise they can accommodate, and also you determine sort of the end point of their validity. To what level of sea level rise do they help? And next thing is, of course, see if you can analyze the combination of these measures. Now, it's a bit of a complicated plot. It sort of takes the plot that Catherine showed earlier a little bit to a little bit more detail. So let's assume that you have a crest wall. It's a little simple drawing here in the left. You have the current situation. It's not good enough. You have sea level rise here. You have a crest wall, and that crest wall would help you for the first ½ meter of sea level rise. After that, this won't work. Well, maybe then allowing some grass strengthening would give you another meter or so. Or you could go to adding a berm in front. That would help you even further. Or increase the foreshore, make an offshore breakwater. But all these solutions, or the combination of these solutions, have a limited target. So the nice thing of this adaptive pathways method and tool is that you can combine these different options and find a pathway to an optimal solution, both technically but also economically. As an example here, you can also start with grass strengthening. Okay, where do you come up then? And well, you can, as you can imagine, you can make all these different kind of combinations. and it gets a bit, well, it's a bit in gray here, but you can imagine that becomes a total mess just looking at it. But of course you can automate it, and you can analyze all these different combinations and finding maybe the economical most best solution, but also maybe the pathway to accommodate the highest level of sea level rise, and to avoid a lock-in. For example, you start with a solution and it ends somewhere, and you cannot add another solution or build on top of that for another solution. So it's really important to make a sequence of, or think of a sequence of adaptations that are complementary and can build on each other. In that sense, you don't have to invest straight away all your money into a measure, but you can take it in steps and adapt and modify based on the situation that is going there. So knowledge gaps and the role of experimental facilities. So I'm going back to my cool pictures. Yeah, what you have traditionally is that a lot of our field in coastal engineering has been in single design solutions, simplified forcings. It's often a mix of physics and also empirical relations. But yeah, these adaptation measures require us to be more creative. It's not just about building a dike. It's not about building a wall or dredging some sand away. It's often now a combination, and these combinations are often very hard to assess how safe they are. You want to make sure how efficient they are. So here's a couple of examples where we combine roughness with a berm or in oblique waves, and it's these kind of things that we often don't have appropriate design rules for, and that's where we can where we come in. So that's the first thing what you do there is often start these experiments, gain insight, try to develop the models, develop empirical formulations, and in that way, let's say with your experimental facilities, with your models that you develop, your empirical relations, then you get a whole tool set, an updated tool set that helps you to develop these kind of designs. And in a way, yeah, I think Jeroen called it his layer one. Within that layer one, you have all these various options to make these kind of adaptations. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and it's been a great fun to participate in this conference so far.
Dirk-Jan, thank you very much. There's very interesting stuff here. I mean, we could go all day with all of these little toys that you've got out there, but we need to come back to this. There's a lot of really good stuff here. Jeroen and you have both suggested some things that we need to be investing more in, and this is the problem that we face when we have such gaps and such delays in investing in our infrastructure.
Thank you.
You're welcome, and we want you back. Thank you. Our last Dutch speaker is Matthias Boos, who is the Lead Climate Adaptation and Flood Resilience Director for Royal Haskoning, DHV, and he is going to be speaking about software aids to calculating Port of Rotterdam cost-benefit defenses. And Matthias has been with us at every conference we've had. So he's become one of our old hands here, and he provides us with some very interesting software analyses of what impact and cost-benefit strategies ports need to have, which as the Propeller Club, we are very interested in. Matthias, welcome, and you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Stans. Thank you for having me again. Really enjoying the conference again. Indeed, I'll talk you through.
We're having a problem hearing you, Matthias.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I will speak like this. Okay, thank you again, Stans, for having me. Looking forward to present you what I've prepared. Here you go. A bit of background on our firm. So I work for Royal Haskoning DHV. It's a Dutch engineering firm. We are working all around the world, as you can see with the blue areas in the map. So we have over 6,000 colleagues in 140 countries. We're also active in America or in the US, and looking forward to do more as well in the future, of course. Bit of background what we are doing. So we're having leading services, and one of them is the resilience in cities, and climate change is part of that. But also we are like the second biggest maritime consultant in the world, and we're doing on lots on airports, consumer goods, and tunnels, and smart water in cities, and wastewater treatment. A bit on our revenue, so it's over 600 million, and as you can see, about 8% of that is in the Americas. We have different kinds of clients, so these are the governments, but also the industries and infrastructure utilities. And as you can see, we have different disciplines, as I am in the water discipline or market group. So it's one of the smaller ones, but highly specialized. So we are talking about flood risk today, and flood resilience. It's actually funny. The picture of Canon in Thailand was also shown by by Kathy. So actually, I have the same picture. As we worked in Thailand after the 2011 flood. We also worked in Houston after these floods, but also for like big major clients like Unilever had experienced floods in Turkey. So we work all around the world, and we help clients. So a bit on what we're doing and the case I want to discuss. So it's about the Europort, and our tool software aids how we do it. So this is a print screen of the tool, and actually I will show you more. So what are we doing? So it's called the Global Flood Risk Tool. So what we do is risk mapping and planning, and we do this to formulate resilience strategies. It's an online service, so it's in the cloud, and we have like a 5-step approach, which I will show. It's also fast calculations, like Catherine told. It's also within a minute with a very high resolution of 5 meters. And then it becomes visually attractive, so it ultimately directly translates into maps that you can see when the calculation is performed. And that helps with the decision making because everything is visual. You can change a lot, and then again, you get different results. So here as well, you see it on the map or on the screen. You can have it in stakeholder sessions, going through the assessments. So what we're doing, and we have the 5 steps approach. So we have the flood hazard. So that's the blue map, or where is the water, and you have the damages. So where are your assets, how are they vulnerable, and how are they impacted. From that we can determine the flood risk. So it's actually like the combined of all events to determining your average annual losses. And from that, we see and we learn how much we could spend to avoid or to reduce these risks. And we develop flood measures. And we can compare them to get to the most optimal business case. So the case we are talking about is the Europort. So I put a circle on the map. You can see Amsterdam in the top and Rotterdam in the middle. So the Port of Rotterdam, and I specifically talk about the Europort. Actually, the Europort is, the area is not so old. It's from the 80s. So actually, at that point in time, they already know that they should build it high enough. So it's indeed land reclaimed and on relative high grounds. But still, they want to know like how it would respond to climate change and increase sea level rise. So what we did, we assessed the economic impact of that area. but also looked into like loss of life or chemical damages, but these found not to be dominant. So what we did is we overlay the hazard maps with our land uses, and these land uses is very specific industry types or port types. So we have the damage functions and the asset values, and if we all combine these, we can calculate the damages within the port. And now I will show you like the flood hazard. So for the different return period or the different probabilities, and then you can see with increasing return period, you can also see that the flood extent is increasing, and actually with like a very high return period, like most of the port is flooded. You can see this event is for the 2050 scenario with like a sea level rise of 35 centimeters, like to say 1 feet. So I said we overlay them with the land use and the damage functions, and then you can see where is the damages. And now you see like compared to the flood extent, where are the damages. But now also you can see like the amount of damages with the coloring. And also what is particular is that there is a lot of flooding in the top north corner, but actually there are no assets, so also no damage. But then it becomes interesting because actually the port wants to develop that area. So also asks us, how can we do that? And there's also this very red area. It's also very, the damages can become very high. So also something to remember. I told you we also looked into risk. So now we combine the different return periods and make it one risk map. So here you see we combine it. The red areas are with the highest risk. And you can see with climate change and increased sea level rise, the red area become more reddish, and also the flood extent or the risk extent map increases. And even up to 2100 becomes even more severe. And then in the end, the port is planning for the 2050. So actually the 2100 scenario they use for their background or for their information, but not for actual planning. So how would it look like for the port to plan on the 2050 map? And that is what we did. So again, also like a kind of a framework with the different levels of protection or different measures, as also explained by previous presenters. And so we try to combine them and test them on their effectiveness to come to a strategy. We have kind of business case modeling to look into what is the actual protection level you want to protect this area, but also want to know what is the best measure to do at what location. So what you can see is indeed the damages per return period, but also if you compare that with the investments and you get to these BCR numbers, as was also explained. The interesting part of this is that you can also see what can become a good and representable protection level for this port area, as it has no there's no law on this port area or no protection standard that is enforced. So they have to come up themselves. And based on this analysis, they also found out that it would be good to have it around 300 or 1000 years protection level, and not to go to the highest of, let's say, or the 10,000 years. So now you know what is your protection level, and also know what can be interesting strategies, and you have that all together. You combine it with multi-criteria analysis also to involve like different aspects like socioeconomic or planning aspects or environmental aspects to not only look at money. And as you can see as well, for that tip, so area 1 here, they came up with a plan. They want to build like a food facility. And so they came up with this design, also included more green to also make it more attractive, but also directly take on the advice of protecting this area. And as you can see in the picture below, it's actually all under construction, where I did this assessment in 2019. So actually, right after that, they took on the advice and started also creating. Also, yeah, you can see it a bit, but also creating that protection for this area. So this was it. Maybe a bit on the tool itself to give you a very brief view. So actually, this is indeed how the tool looks like. As you can see, it's actually a tool online where you can click through like the different return periods, the different damages for different time horizons, and also risks. And also you can recalculate by going to the options and include new parameters and rerun your model. But I will leave that for now. That was it, Stans.
Okay, Matthias, thank you very much. Guys, there's a lot of different stuff out in the market here, and we've seen the Deltares models. We've seen the ones from Royal Haskoning. Jeroen has discussed the bigger picture about what's happening with a place like Shanghai and Rotterdam, where the governments and the countries have the money to make the big ticket investments. My question is, we're talking right now about applying these models, and obviously in Rotterdam, the port has a big investment. There's a history of having done this. The Netherlands has a long history. You've got some interesting software. How does the United States compare? I know I don't want you to be dissing the competition too much, but how are you guys further along in the Netherlands than we are in the United States because of your longer historical experiences?
Yeah, maybe I can briefly try to answer. It's a difficult question. It's also a matter of culture, Stas. So I'm not really going to compare it, but obviously, I mean, the necessity for us to defend ourselves is bigger, right? Because 1/3 of the country is below sea level. So I mean, and we have this history for centuries of defending ourselves against the sea. Every child in school is learning about the Netherlands history, and it's a fight against water. So there's a big cultural difference. So the protection, so this layer 1 is in our genes, so to say. But also we can learn quite a lot from the US, in the sense that in the US you are quite involved in the flood insurance system and the building codes, more, let's say, a more personal touch on flood management, and we don't have that in the Netherlands. So that's I think is good. I think we are a little bit further ahead in the long-term thinking. So thinking ahead, not 1 year or until the next election of 4 years, but a little bit more than that. So it is also government policy that large infrastructure projects are tested and assessed against climate change projections, for example. And that's something that's the US is catching up on that, I think, but there's, I think, a little bit of a difference.
Thank you, Jeroen. Dirk and Matthias, any comments from either of you?
Yeah, I agree with Jeroen. I think he said it very well. I think you know, I've worked in the US a lot as well, and one of the things that for example we are lacking, it's in our system, as Jeroen said, but at the same time, let's say the people living here, it's so safe that people are not aware that there's a risk. So, like for example, having an emergency kit at home for if something happens, we don't have, because everybody assumes we are totally safe. So we're almost, sometimes I wonder we're a little bit almost too safe, because people are losing touch with where we live and what could happen to us. And I think institutionally, it's very well arranged. The water boards in the Netherlands are the oldest, what do you call it, legal bodies before the governments. So they were already there before the Netherlands itself as a country was actually there. So that gives you an idea how well it is. It's based in our legal society, but at the same time, yeah, I think I agree with you. And there's also stuff that we can learn from you. But so I think that there's a lot to learn from each other. And also, when I worked in the US, you know, our models I think are advanced, but there's good models in the US as well. But it's often the combination of expertise and insights that have to make it work.
Okay, thank you. Matthias, is there a competitor software that you showed us in the United States?
No, don't think so. No, not in the combination of visualization and cloud computing. So there is a competitor in Denmark, the DHI. That's our big competitor, and of course Deltares will do it, like Catherine showed. But also in other projects we work together with Deltares, so we do it together. So also that goes in ways. And maybe one thing to add also in the port projects I'm working on, we do a lot on stakeholder involvement with like the actual tenants of the port. And what we do in these projects, and there also, that was my driver also to get this visualized, is to do joint fact finding. So to do these assessments together and not alone as an engineer and then come back with reports, but actually involve them, as they need to invest in these adaptation measures. Not that the port will do it, they will have to do it together. So to bring them along and make this story together really helps in like putting this forward.
Well, I want to conclude with one small story, which is 10 years old, is that a United States port that I will not identify gave its presentation on sea level rise. And they showed that the pier that they had in 2000 was now being raised by 10 feet. And they said, so we have solved the sea level rise problem at our port. So obviously we know that that's more complicated. And I think everybody in the US and around the world now realizes that there's a lot of interchangeability. And as we heard from Caltrans, the transportation systems are very interlinked, and there are many, many moving parts, and your ability to bring those various aspects together in one place is very helpful in decision making. So thank you guys, all three of you, very much, and for staying up late. We also appreciate it. I have a question. Our international, oh, hold on a second. Gonil, can I ask one last question? I can't see what the question is. I'm going to have to switch over because we're running late. If you could send me your question, I will send it to our Dutch presenters because we are running a little late, and I want to keep us a little bit on track here. So guys, thank you very much. Our next presenters are discussing saltwater threats to U.S. Atlantic, Gulf, and Pacific Coast water supplies. And they are Gracie Todd and Bill Lambrecht. They are co-authors of Saltwater Threats to U.S. Atlantic, Gulf, and Pacific Coast water supplies. They are a team that worked out of the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism and I want to welcome them. And Howard, are you going to be speaking and Gracie doing the slides, or are you both going to be speaking?
Bill will be speaking for the first half of the presentation, and then I'll take over for the second half.
I meant to say Bill, sorry. Okay, Bill,
Center.
I said Howard Center and then I got lost. Okay, Bill, I apologize. Bill, you have the floor.
Hey, Bill, you're muted. You should be able to unmute.
Thanks very much. Great to be with you. The Howard Center for Investigative Journalism at the University of Maryland thanks you for letting us be part of this gathering. We're journalists, so it's nice to be around people who know so much. Gracie Todd and I spent much of 2020 looking at this issue of saltwater intrusion, a feature of climate change I think is often overlooked, particularly in rural areas. Saltwater intrusion can be viewed, I think, as the leading edge of climate change in many ways, at a time when other impacts are maybe less evident. We called what we did saltwater invasion, and I believe there are a boatload of studies out there pointing to some fairly ominous changes ahead. Not just the salt arriving via new flooding and the more frequent storm surges, but also salt water seeping and creeping stealthily beneath the surface. The underground flood, it's sometimes called, it doesn't get a whole lot of attention because you don't see it. You can't take a picture of it like water rushing on Miami Beach streets. I think we've seen a picture or two of that today, but it's happening. And before we got into the game, researchers at the University of Maryland, University of Delaware, Duke, NC State, among others, were deep into measuring impacts, not just projected, but what is happening right now. Saltwater intrusion is nothing new in places like South Florida, which was losing public wells more than a century ago after draining the Everglades and messing up so much plumbing, but it's new to a lot of people here in the mid-Atlantic, especially when it comes to the environmental components. Now, by way of definition, we're speaking here about the landward migration of salt water, typically a result of freshwater pumping from an aquifer. Now, that freshwater saltwater interface moves inexorably landward, threatening not only water supplies, but entire ecosystems. And I think saltwater intrusion is getting redefined these days by sea level rise, which is more pronounced in some places, but is particularly evident along the Atlantic and Gulf coast and quite noticeable here on Chesapeake Bay, where I am located. We spoke with more than 100 researchers and officials at various levels. We took our own salinity samples in coastal Maryland and Virginia. We used a drone. We crushed a lot of scientific measurements. And what we found in some are heightening threats to drinking water and some fairly eye-popping changes in coastal ecosystems. I think that what we and others are seeing is noteworthy, given that 40% of people in the United States live in coastal counties. Now, there's a lot of new research out there that I think can help light the paths of lawmakers and planners when weighing sea level rise sea level defense investments. That $2.3 trillion, and I said $trillion infrastructure plan we're hearing about, it's also a cornerstone of this administration's climate plan. Beyond money, there are many policy decisions hanging fire. For instance, there are new directions likely as far as pricing carbon. We don't know how far this administration will go, but we do know that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is a huge proponent. And this could be relevant in coastal areas as far as preserving marshes and swamps. People talk about draining the swamps here, but even though wetlands are usually valuable as carbon sinks. Now, why is this important? In a recent 20-year period, more than 5,000 square miles of coastal and river swamps disappeared, we found from NOAA satellite data. We're seeing more drinking water issues ahead in smaller water systems, and we're seeing huge systems like Miami-Dade's under pressure. The price of water there is going up 5% every year for local, for commercial and residential users every year for at least the next decade. The Miami area also is dealing with an underground flood. By our count, more than a third of the geological surveys, more than 200 monitoring wells in South Florida show significant trends of increasing salinity. And Florida has a special problem. The Turkey Point nuclear plant on Biscayne Bay has spewed a vast underground salt plume ever closer to the well fields of South Miami. The impacts on the Everglades are well known, but a lesser known story, I think, is the extent of coastal-wide changes in the mid-Atlantic region through the Carolinas, where coastlines are literally being resculpted as the salt line advances. The Chesapeake Bay region in Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia is especially vulnerable because coastal land here has been sinking from geologic changes back to the last ice age. In Louisiana, we've heard about that today, ongoing coastal erosion made worse over the years by oil and gas operations is producing more of America's early climate refugees. We focused on some of the most vulnerable, the Native American tribes along the coast. Salt kills plants from the roots up and stunts their growth, which farmers are finding in coastal regions here in the Chesapeake Bay and North Carolina especially, where salinity is too high for crops they're accustomed to. The solution here is salt tolerant crops. Asparagus does great. Quinoa is fabulous. What about markets and the investments already made in machinery and for corn and soybeans and the row crops that are common in coastal areas out here? There are recreational and cultural values too in many of these coastal lands beset by saltwater intrusion. The Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge on Chesapeake Bay, across the water from where I'm sitting here, has seen monthly visitor increases during the pandemic of more than 400%. And that's with the visitor center closed. But encroaching saltwater is turning portions of Blackwater into ghost forests. Acres of skeletons of trees bleached white from the sun, emerging from the ground like crosses. Expansion of Blackwater is happening right now with more than one reward. Expanding these lands promotes marsh migration caused by these advancing seawaters. A recent purchase of several thousand acres is preserving homelands too of Harriet Tubman, the abolitionist, conductor of the Underground Railroad, and icon to many. Thanks again, and Gracie Todd will continue this.
Yeah, echoing Bill's sentiment, thank you so much for having us. So as Bill mentioned, managed marsh migration can be a part of the solution, but marshes can move inland whether managed or not. And sometimes they have nowhere to go and can take over valuable land where there's other ecosystems or even land where people live and grow food. So as it moves in on farmland, it can spoil the soil to the point where most crops won't grow. The problem is urgent and fast moving. Here's satellite footage showing that many areas that were suitable for farming in 2011 no longer were just 6 years later. That's from a study by the Universities of Maryland and Delaware and the USDA. Bob Fitzgerald, whose family has farmed in Somerset County since the mid-17th century, told Bill, "I quit farming because it drowned out every damned year." On the West Coast, saltwater is destroying some of the world's most productive farmland. California's Central Valley grows the majority of the nation's tomatoes, apricots, asparagus, and grapes, and the majority of the world's almonds, and a quarter of all food in the nation. But salt is threatening all of this. An estimated 250,000 acres have gone out of production due to salt accumulation, and 1.5 million acres are designated salt impaired. It's like the early stages of cancer, said Daniel Kozad, the executive director of the Central Valley Salinity Coalition. He said, "You don't feel it, you don't see it, and everything seems to be pretty normal. But if you're not keeping track of it, it can get much worse." So these case studies and some of the case studies and implications we've showed demonstrate the far-reaching and interconnected impacts of saltwater intrusion. We're going to turn to solutions next, which means it's a really good time for an overview of the causes, because we can't come up with solutions before we stop contributing to the problem. Of course, this is a climate crisis-driven issue. All of us can do our part there, but some can do more than others. For example, if the concrete industry, the maritime shipping industry, and the Department of Defense for each individual countries, they would be ranked 3rd, 6th, and 55th, respectively, among the world's top polluters. The maritime shipping industry alone releases about 3% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and the concrete industry releases about 8%. There's also narrow actions which can be known to cause saltwater intrusion. There's overpumping the groundwater, which we can improve with conservation efforts. And then there's channel digging. So channel digging, channel deepening, these all allow saltwater to move more efficiently inland. A channel deepening project on the Delaware River completed last year by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers facilitated saltwater flow upriver, dealing what may end up being the final blow to a unique prehistoric fish that lives there and spawns in freshwater. Only about 300 of these fish survive today. In Louisiana, we spoke to a tribal chief whose nation has been devastated by saltwater intrusion, made worse by canal-cutting oil and gas companies. They've lost land and the ability to self-sustain by growing food and even medicinal plants. The communities who have done the least to cause the increase in greenhouse gas emissions are on the front lines of addressing this awful issue, said Robin Bronin of the Alaska Institute for Justice. Those who have done the most to drive this issue also have the most power and responsibility to address it. But these efforts must be guided by those suffering on the front lines, and they need to be far more ambitious than the Paris Climate Agreement. Most experts agree that's better for PR than it is for real meaningful change. So now a few solutions people are coming up with to address saltwater intrusion specifically. Each faces unique challenges. So the freshwater crisis is ongoing. By 2025, the UN predicts water scarcity will impact 2/3 of the population. Here are just a few ways people are responding. In California, they're investing millions of dollars into a statewide survey of groundwater using helicopters in this technique called the airborne electromagnetic method. I would recommend looking more into it. It's really, really interesting, pretty cool stuff. It's the kind of imaging that doctors depend on for medical imaging. Rosemary Knight, a professor and researcher at Stanford University, told us, and it provides a really clear image of emerging and existing saltwater intrusion. This can be important because it's hard to address an issue without a clear view of what we're dealing with. Desalination turns saltwater into fresh drinking water, which is a really compelling solution, but it also raises concerns about environmental harm, cost, and access. So in Cape May, New Jersey, they turned to desalination after decades of overpumping and overdevelopment forced the city to abandon hundreds of wells. It's already cost the city millions of dollars to build a desalination plant and keep it operating, and it plans to spend millions more soon, increasing already high water rates by about 10 to 15%. That's a cost some who are impoverished in Cape May County might really struggle to pay. And that raises issues concerning environmental justice. Jeff Tittle, director of the New Jersey Sierra Club, calls the Cape May plant a symbol of, quote, the hubris of man thinking we can always overcome any natural resource. You're really changing the ecology of the region, he said. That's because the plant releases brine, and more than that, it pumps from the groundwater, which further increases further encourages saltwater intrusion into a source shared with various ecosystems and is shared with other cities which may not have access to desalination. So they're still going to be pumping out of this groundwater that's becoming even more saltwater intruded. Doug O'Malley, Director of Environment New Jersey, argues for conservation. You're going to need to say no to new development permits, he said. Coastal communities are the mother's milk for adult developers, and we are loving the shore to death. Even desalination, which draws from the ocean, raises some concerns. The intakes can suck in flora and fauna, often those belonging to endangered species. And environmental justice concerns persist over issues related to affordability and accessibility. Protecting our source of food will require conservation efforts too, including on the part of the agricultural industry. Some farmers in California have started using recycled water, which greatly contributes to these efforts. They've been pretty successful and are less expensive than some other solutions. In the meantime, though, researchers are helping farmers adapt. So in many areas, including North Carolina's Blacklands, the Eastern Shore in Maryland, we talked about, California's Central Valley, they're struggling to grow traditional crops. But as Bill said, they can grow asparagus, animal fodder, sorghum. The problem is it's expensive to change crops, and often the salt resistant ones aren't quite as profitable as those traditionally grown. But Kate Tolley, who's shown in this picture here, she says there's hope for some more profitable salt-tolerant crops like barley, which can be sold to breweries, and quinoa, which really hasn't caught on with farmers outside of Colorado. Another potential recourse is the USDA, which is buying salt-damaged farmland to convert into marshland restoration. But these programs are facing budget cuts due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and they don't appeal to all farmers. Not everybody loves the government buying up land, said Marcia Pradines, a fish and wildlife biologist. So mitigation, again, is important, but researchers say that stemming saltwater intrusion altogether is not possible. We cannot stop the devastation we've already caused, so we must also adapt in the meantime. Some adaptations may be better than others. For example, there's hard infrastructure like seawalls and bulkheads, which are raising major red flags. These can encourage more development in a sort of vicious cycle as they encourage this development in the exact coastal areas which cannot handle it, causing further damage and offering piecemeal coverage to a coast-wide problem. Again, those who need it most often aren't the ones that are being targeted for these sort of protections. Fostering natural growth may be a better option. Marshlands, for example, store carbon and offer millions of dollars per square kilometer in storm protection. At Blackwater, researchers planted native plants and sprayed sediment dredged from the river in order to rehabilitate 40 acres of deteriorating marshland. This project cost nearly $1 million. But an important clarification here, the solutions are not the source of the cost. Rather, the cost stems from unpaid debts incurred by those who have exploited the Earth's resources. Here's just a slice of what's at stake. So nature can't be priced, but it can offer us a safe harbor from the increasing anxieties sweeping the world. Earlier this month, Vice President Kamala Harris said, "For years, there were wars fought over oil. In a short time, there will be wars fought over water." I was shocked by this, not only because US officials rarely admit that we fight wars over oil. So I'll enter my opinion here. Solutions should aim to prevent water wars, not determine who the winner will be. Once again, thank you so much for having us. A pleasure to be here. And you can find our series of articles at cnsmaryland.org/saltwater-invasion. And please don't hesitate to reach out to either Bill and I with further questions.
Thank you very much, Grace. Our next speaker is Kyle Hopkins, who is a partner at Austin Engineering. And he will be speaking about the company's prototype desalination, which has just been a subject of some criticism by Grace. Kyle's topic is offshore desalination to mitigate flooding and saltwater threats. Kyle, welcome. you've been preceded by some critical comments about the negative impact of desalination, and perhaps you could begin by talking a little bit about how your prototype hopes to address those issues.
Absolutely, Stas. Have you seen my screen now? Do you see the screen?
I did, but we've lost it again. Can you come back with that? Where Todd? Did we
Yeah, it came up, but it went back. Try again. There you go.
Okay.
We should be good.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Honored to learn from so many people. And Stas, thank you again for organizing all of this, and Todd keeping everything on track. As Stas said, we're going to talk a little bit about offshore desalination to mitigate flooding and saltwater threats. And Grace and Bill couldn't have done a better setup, because let's look at desalination. Firstly, it's obviously on land, and that's expensive. Coastal land is of high value. And I'm guessing none of us have ever been to a great cafe or to a show and said, did you know this used to be a desalination plant? My point is, once a desalination plant is built, it's a long-term opportunity cost. They can't be retrofitted, and generally desal plants are built larger than they need to be to allow for future expansion and added capacity. And of course, it's very expensive and typically far away from the point of need, which requires more water grid that leads to non-revenue water. Up to 50% of water is lost just in the piping from the desal plant to the point of use. Grace talked a little bit about the intake, and this is a huge problem. For one, it's expensive. 10% of capital expenditures are spent on intake, and it entrains and entraps sea life, which basically means it kills and harms sea life, which requires chemicals to pre-treat the water. And that's about 10% of operating expenses. And those chemicals, as Grace said, flow to the ocean in the brine. Now, a recent UN University report found that we're creating globally 50% more brine than previously thought. That means there's 56,800 Olympic-sized swimming pools every day flowing into the ocean of brine. If we looked over a course of a year, we could cover Florida with 30 centimeters of brine in 1 year. And brine is so bad because it's highly saline, up to 200% more saline than the surrounding ocean. And it sinks to the ocean floor, and it kills the seagrass and the benthic life and very much harms the sea environment. Now, the standard RO membranes have to work through all of this to produce the permeate, the clean water. And in general, they're replaced every 5 years at a desalination plant. They're not recycled. It is possible to recycle RO membranes, but it's cost prohibitive. So what ends up happening is globally, we throw away 12,000 tons of RO membranes in heaps that you can find particularly in the Middle East. Many of us are familiar about the high cost of energy for desalination. As some guideposts, in Saudi Arabia, 25% of daily oil production is used for desalination. That's going to be over 1.5 million barrels burnt today. In less than 10 years, that's going to be 6 million barrels. And by 2040, 8 million barrels of oil burned every day to convert into water. So this is a huge problem that we're all facing. But at Oysan Engineering, we do things a little bit differently. First, we start offshore. That saves the coastal land for other purposes and reduces the capital expenses. We put standard RO membranes 300 meters below the surface. And that takes away the need to use the pre-filtration of chemicals for pre-treatment. And it doesn't have an effect on the sea life because at 300 meters depth, there's minimal light and less sea life. And also the intake is very low that sea life can swim away. Because we turn the equation of desalination on its head, and we don't look at the recovery ratio as a goal to be achieved, we don't produce brine. We return water to the ocean that's roughly 6% more saline than the surrounding ocean, which means in 1 or 2 meters, you cannot detect any difference versus the up to 200% more saline that you find in standard desalination. Our partner in the RO membranes jokes with us that we might put them out of business because using these parameters, the membranes can last 2 to 4 times longer. So there's a great reduction in this growing plastic waste problem. And we can work with onshore, floating, or shallow water wind turbines to power the systems. And there are 3 models of water fountain. We have the water fountain 10, which is Stas reference, what we're currently producing and going to market with. That's 2,000 cubic meters per day. And these are modular standalone units, so we can cluster water fountain 10s and place them in arrays along the coast close to the point of need, where the water is piped to the point of need with a lay flat pipe on the ocean floor. In the middle, we have a vessel-based unit, which is 40,000 cubic meters, which even in the Middle East is increasingly the size of new plants. But for the mega plants, we do have an offshore installation model, and that can go up to 200,000 cubic meters per day. So these are the different scales of water fountain. And I'd like to show you a picture. I know we've seen a lot of pictures of water and flooding, but this one I find quite dramatic. This is Jakarta, Indonesia, a little bit over a year ago. And unfortunately, it's a scene of a lot of flooding, and I've experienced a lot of them myself over the years living there. And it's 15 million people in Jakarta, 2 million living in North Jakarta, where flooding like this is very common. The Indonesian government made some studies, and they found that to relocate the capital and 2 million people who are in this flood area would cost between tens of billions or hundreds of billions of US dollars. Why is this occurring? Among other reasons, the primary driver is groundwater extraction. The city has sunk 8 feet in the last 10 years, and it's already a low-lying swampy area to start with, especially in the north. Grace and Bill just educated us about scenes like this, the ghost forests. And what struck me the most as I read a little bit about this for myself. 40% of the global population lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. That's 60 miles of the coast. So these kind of problems are going to be very familiar to many of us all over the world. And it's not just the forests and the ecosystems that are going to suffer, but as Grace was saying, some communities are going to have saltwater intrusion because of actions of other communities that they have no control over. But it's not all bad news. I love this picture because, well, I love California rice. And the funny thing is, before Central Valley was a rice bowl, it really wasn't a very productive agricultural area. And it's because of the wise use of water and irrigation that it became, as Grace was explaining, such a powerhouse in the global agricultural world. But it is at risk of saltwater intrusion in the San Joaquin Delta. And what I like to propose is, why don't we use the technologies we have, floating wind turbines, offshore desalination, to serve the urban coastal areas with water, to allow more water to be used in a way that mitigates saltwater intrusion to these farming areas that are so important economically and for the global food security. Just a small fact here. In Orange County, 50 golf courses use the equivalent of 10% of Nevada's allotment from the Colorado River. So we can make huge changes just by rethinking how we serve the urban versus agricultural areas in California alone. And I believe that we have the institutions, we have the technologies, and in fact, the offshore wind turbine that's going up in Northern California is a great place to look at the technologies that are available and are being implemented. And we have the funding. I believe, as Bill was saying, there's funding, there's political will, there's institutions, there's the technologies. So let's work together and let's get it done. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Kyle. So one of the obvious questions here is, can we ever reach the scale using desal, and what kind of offshore infrastructure would it require to provide substitute water for the Central Valley and help mitigate water requirements for Northern California, let alone the Atlantic coast and Florida and the Gulf? So maybe you could answer that, and then I'll ask Grace and Bill to come in.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the chance to expand on that, Stas. The quick answer is yes. We have offshore wind turbines going up in Northern California. In terms of the form factor that could use that power, we have globally for decades used offshore installations. And that is the model that we built the water fountain max around, which is going to produce up to 200,000 cubic meters per day. And the water can be delivered with water tankers, which exist in operation today. And like the smaller units, the large units are also modular and can be repeated. So the answer is absolutely yes, we can. The technology, the physics, the science, it's all there. And if we look at it, some decades ago, we were wondering how much of this wonderful black stuff can we get out of the ocean floor? And we built a whole infrastructure and technology and jackup rigs and all sorts of equipment all over the world in remote areas and made it a reality. We can do much more and much better using the same kind of approach and entrepreneurialism to solve these water challenges. So the answer is absolutely yes. And I believe that there will be the will. And the key thing is, let's prove ourselves each step of the way. Start small, supplement what's already happening, and prove and build from there and gain momentum. Thank you.
Your module, your first one, is going to be is in process of being constructed. When do you expect to have it out, and when will you start to get test results?
Yes, thank you, Stas. You're correct. We're getting all of the different pieces together, and we have everything ready to go in our manufacturing facility here in Norway. And for the Dutch folks still on the line, we also have a Dutch company, so we're active there as well. Q3, we'll have the test results back in, and we'll be demonstrating, and it will be ready for operation in Q4 of this year.
Okay. Grace, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I really didn't mean any direct criticism towards your desalination. I was just raising concerns generally. I don't know enough about it, but I would like to ask how you'll confront issues of accessibility. Who will be deciding who has access to this technology versus who doesn't, and will it lead to greater privatization of water?
Wow, Grace, thank you so much for all of those points. I love them all. And we'll continue this conversation after this conference. Quick answer, we've developed a plan to mitigate this problem that's happening all over the world, which is utilities turning off water of people who can't pay. I did some quick math the other day, and I found, based on research that was done, 25,000 US citizens died in COVID-19 because they had their water turned off. 25,000 people in the US alone, just because they couldn't pay their water bill during a pandemic. And we didn't have a nationwide moratorium on shutting off people's water. In Jamaica, they have $26 million of unreceivable receivables at the water utility there. 6,000 people have had their water turned off since December 1 of last year because they can't pay. We have a plan that allows those utilities to serve the underserved communities and the temporary communities like you find in South Africa with water, and not have to turn them off using the water fountain. And there's an economic model behind the science there as well. So we're very much looking at this problem of privatization and how do we get access and use the technology that way.
Okay. Bill, what do you think of all of this?
Well, when you're dealing with anything offshore, you run into a great deal of political problem. As I look out across the Chesapeake Bay here, I recall some of the proposals as far as wind turbines in Maryland and Virginia, and you encounter the issues not just of the environmental advocates, but also the people who might not normally be worried about climate change, being upset about their viewscapes. So I wish him good luck in trying to pave the way for this new technology.
Okay.
If I may, this will be outside of the view. So it won't be like a giant oil rig in front of your house. You won't see it. And on the small scale, it has the same footprint as a small vessel. So certainly those are concerns that are very real and quite localized in many environments in the world, and important points to consider.
Great.
Guys, we have, this is the issue of the contamination of groundwater is a big sleeper here. We have really are very grateful to both Bill and Grace for having helped spearhead this process by your excellent reports. We've known about this problem, as you both said, for some time, but the problem is accelerating at a very fast pace, and past is no longer prologue with climate change. So I want to commend both of you for the really excellent work that you've done in identifying where the problems are and what it is that we need to do. And we still don't have clear ideas, but I hope that Kyle's program and the Water Fountain Project will help give us a leg up on the problem. We have to conclude here because we've gone over, not too bad, but we have gone over, and for some people in Norway and the Netherlands, it's getting later and later at night. Let me just say that I want to thank everybody for their presentations. I want to cite the fact that this is an ongoing process, but the issue of infrastructure and infrastructure spending is going to give us perhaps an opportunity to move forward at a faster pace than we have over the last 40 years. And as several speakers have said, it will be because we have begun to factor resiliency into the infrastructure model and climate change into the infrastructure model, so that we can begin an advanced planning and an advanced investment that addresses the issues that we have discussed over flooding and also saltwater contamination. The Propeller Club and the Society of American Military Engineers are planning a November conference. I again urge anyone who wishes to speak to contact either myself or Arvin with their presentations. We look forward to hearing from SAE members and Propeller Club members, as well as the community of specialists that we have drawn upon today. We obviously have a lot to do and do not have a lot of time to do it. And as I referenced at the beginning, this danger and this crisis that we have discussed is going to be hurting our younger people. It's going to be hurting them very soon. And we need to start investing in solutions that start to alleviate the problem and begin to start changing directions. So with that, I want to thank you all. Please remember about your presentations if you're interested. The answer to questions that were raised, we are recording this. Todd will make the recordings available probably tomorrow, Todd? Yeah, okay. So they should be available tomorrow. I will email a link to everybody on the who's attended so that you can get the recording copies. Almost all of the presentations that we have in PowerPoint are also available. Todd's got all of those together. We've got one last one. So again, tomorrow, I think that we should be able to have those available if you want PowerPoints. If there are any studies or reports or issues that you would like us to raise or to disseminate, please let me know and we will get those out. I will try and get as many resources out to people who are presenters and attendees so that we have information flowing. And please keep us abreast of anything that you think that we ought to know. We know that past, as I said, is no longer prologue. Things are moving at a very dangerous and very fast pace. And unfortunately, recent history in the United States has slowed down our ability to respond. There are a number of issues that we have to address, and hopefully we will use this vehicle as one small, modest step for all of us to wage the war against climate change and improve resiliency. And with that, I am Stas Margaronis. I want to thank you for your presentation on behalf of Arvin Acharya and General Schrodel at the Society of American Military Engineers. Thank them. I want to thank John Collather for coming on board. I want to thank you all for all of your participation. We will be back in November. Best of luck to all of you in all of your work, and we will do what we can to help you and help ourselves. So with that, best wishes, good afternoon, and we hope to see you soon.